I just feel like I've been around the block, ripping up fantasy stock, working around the clock. Look at the view from the top. Researching rookies a lot? No, I just be listening to pods. Yeah, one in particular, I'm just a messenger. Let me just pass on the rock. Browning, brunning, pruning, pronouncing ain't what he's doing. What he's doing is not losing, but infusing you with new things. And there's Dennis the Bennett, yeah. The man is a menace, yeah. Building a dynasty, some of the finest things. Promise you, you won't regret it. Sly as a fox, cultured in pop. Give him his props. Here is a thought, here is a box, and you cannot compare them at all. So don't even try. Careful with the news, but when you use a take, I take up Tony Fire. I mean Dyer, because anyone else is a huge mistake. Whoa, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, yeah. Fantasy round table. Come take a look at the crown, baby. Hey, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, woo. Fantasy round table. Come take a look at the crown, baby. Go.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Football Roundtable Podcast. It is Friday. We are into March. It's our first episode of March, even though it's March 7th. I am back from Seattle. I got my Seattle shirt on, and maybe that was what prompted
you brought Gino with you.
All the Seattle-based news. We will get to in a minute. We have plenty of news to talk about from the last week, and we will touch on the Combine, which feels like it was an eternity ago, even though it was only a weekend ago. And then we free agency, the legal tampering period begins on Monday. They will start announcing more deals Monday and Tuesday. I'm not going to say start announcing deals because we've already seen some stuff go down Monday and Tuesday. So Dennis and I are going to highlight 5 soon to be snapped up free agents that we're watching for as free agency and the new league year begins. Dennis, it feels like a flurry of activity. You know, we had a couple of quiet weeks after the Eagles won the Super Bowl, but it's kind of exciting to get to this part of the season, see the player movement, see how your fantasy fortunes live and die, especially in Dynasty.
I tell you, it's a great time to be a Dynasty player. This is when you're hopeful for your teams and you watch your team fall apart, and then you get hopeful again without ever actually having to make a single move. I got a team I'm pushing into rebuild. I don't have any draft picks for the next 2 years. I have plenty of assets. I won 2 years ago, suffered a spate of injuries last year, didn't make the playoffs, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to tear it down. Like, everybody's available, and people were like, even Joe Burrow? I'm like, yeah, even Joe Burrow. Mind you, I'm not giving him away. If you want Burrow, you better come strong. And so me and another guy have been chatting. He's interested in Chris Godwin and Evan Ingram. And so made him a nice offer, Godwin and Ingram, for his 110 and his 26 second. Figuring I'll start to accumulate picks over both years because I'm trying to rebuild. But he kind of dragged his feet. And then Evan Ingram got released. I'm like, dang it, there goes that deal. So I then revised the deal and sent him Godwin and Ingram because I expect Ingram's going to land somewhere where he's going to be able to start. I think he's still got some play left in him, and he's a good receiver. So I said, well, how about we do your 210 and 25 and your first rounder in 26? And he's like, you know what? I think I might be into that. Let me think about it. Messages me today. He's like, man, I just can't come up off the first. I'm like, dude, if you look at the Dynasty Nerds Dynasty GM, you've got like a top 2 or 3 team. Godwin and Ingram are going to put you like at the top. The first round picks, you know, anyways, unfortunately the deal didn't get done and it's back to the drawing board.
Well, some deals that did get done. We're going to kick off talking about both the Raiders and the Seahawks. The Raiders obviously getting former Seahawk head coach Pete Carroll, and he went to the well for some of his former players. Let's talk about the Raiders part of this first. Geno Smith was just dealt to the Raiders for a third-round pick. Answers kind of the quarterback question there for the Raiders, who earlier this week released Gardner Minshew. They also granted second-year tight end Michael Mayer permission to seek a trade. He was formerly a second-round pick, but obviously with Brock Bowers, they're pretty set at tight end. So, Brock Bowers is there. Still a lot of questions at running back, but the Raiders do have the number 6 pick, and if they're feeling better about quarterback, maybe they don't have to look there. Could answer some running back questions. They still have Jacoby Myers, probably need a little bit more in the receiver game. But do you like Geno going to the Raiders? And what do you think happens with Michael Mayer?
So at cost, yeah, I think it's fine. I think, Geno's 33 years old now.
Last year of his deal.
1 year left on his deal. So, and it's not a great quarterback class. It's one of those classes where Cam Ward seems to have separated himself as the 1. Shedur's the 2. Jackson Dart's gaining on him. But most evaluators, most draft nicks, not fantasy evaluators, think that they feel that like Cam Ward is like a mid-first rounder, but he's the guy in this class, so he's going early. And Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart are late first to second rounders, but because they're quarterbacks, so many teams, you either have a quarterback or you don't. They say in college all the time, if you got 2 quarterbacks, you ain't got none. And in the NFL, it's like you either got a quarterback or you don't. And there are 5 or 6 teams that really need a quarterback, and they're not getting them out of this draft.
I was interested too. There's been a lot of discussion. Obviously, Tom Brady taking a much bigger role in the front office kind of capacity there now as a part owner with the Raiders. A lot of people, both Brian Hoyer when he was on yesterday in the morning, and I can't remember who the guest was this morning. I think it'll come to me on NFL Network. For a couple of days, have talked about how Brady is actually a big fan of Aiden O'Connell. So I think this kind of is a little bit of a nod toward him. They released Minshew. Now they go get Geno Smith, but he obviously still in the mix. Be curious to see how that plays out. Pete was the one that decided Geno Smith was a perfectly suitable quarterback to lead his team and ditch Russell Wilson. So, there was some thought that the Raiders were maybe going to bring Russell Wilson back for a reunion with Pete Carroll. They got the wrong Seahawk quarterback. He gets Geno Smith. I'll be interested to see how that one goes. But let's switch over to the Seahawks for a minute. Obviously now their quarterback that's on the roster is Sam Howell, who they got for a pretty decent clip. We only saw him briefly last year, and it was not inspiring. So now maybe some questions there. They're changing over their offense. They have 2 good running backs, and they have Jackson Smith and Jigba, and that might be the only pieces they're keeping. I mentioned earlier that they were going into a weird potential offseason where they have a lot of guys on expiring contracts. They decided to release Tyler Lockett, and now DK Metcalf has been given permission to seek a trade. What are you feeling about Seattle? They were a 10-7 team that was very, very close to making the playoffs. This feels like a kind of big blow up on offense.
Well, they brought in Clint Kubiak as offensive coordinator, whose system is different from Ryan Grubb's. And so we see it a lot when teams change coordinators, whether it's offense or defense. They want to get their guys in, guys that know their system, guys that fit their system, whether it's switching from zone blocking to man blocking or switching from 3-4 to 4-3. These are just the realities of life as an NFL player and an NFL coach. So they're going to have to address their quarterback. Howell was my guy in that class. And I think we can all freely admit that was a horrible quarterback class.
He's the only one that might still have a shot at being open. Well, Purdy, I forgot. Brock
Yeah.
Purdy isn't.
But, Mr. Irrelevant is the only one that's really relevant. See what I did there? So they're going to address something. The issue with Howell, he's got a pretty good arm, okay accuracy. There's some he's not fast, but he is mobile. But he holds the ball too long, makes throws that he probably shouldn't. I don't think McDonald, after watching him ride the pine for a year, they're not looking at him as the answer. So Seattle's going somewhere. They pick at 18. Jackson Dart's gaining steam. So, he started a lot of games in college. He's not without flaws, but he seems to have separated himself as the third quarterback in this class. And, when we talk a little bit more about surprises from the combine, I'll talk a little about Shedeur Sanders. Sanders, I don't think he falls to 18. So I think if they're going to draft a quarterback in the first round, it's going to have to be Jackson Dart. I don't think Dart is going to be available later in the round, just because you want to go get your guy if he's there. And when it comes to this quarterback class, there's not a lot of other guys that you really have confidence in. Jalen Milroe, he's just a smaller Anthony Richardson at this point, who runs better, but he's not terribly accurate with the ball. Makes some throws is sometimes great. Richardson does the same thing. Quinn Ewers needs some work. Will Howard, Tyler Shug, all of these other quarterbacks, it would be in their best interest, and probably it would probably be in the best interest of all the first rounders to not play this year either. That's not going to happen. But it feels like if I'm Seattle right now, I'm looking at Jackson Dart at 18. The wild card out there could be Sam Darnold. He put together a really good year, and we know that zone blocking, run heavy scheme doesn't put as much pressure on the quarterback, and that may, he's probably the top guy out there in free agency as far as quarterbacks go, and so maybe Seattle goes that route.
Well, one of the stories we left when we last met was what was going to happen with Matthew Stafford. It seemed like the Rams and the Raiders were narrowing it, or the Giants and the Raiders were narrowing in on him. And in the end, Stafford decided to take a little less money to stay with the Rams. The Rams have subsequently done a one-year deal with Tutu Atwell. He'll be back. And now the most recent comments are that there is a plausible scenario that's gaining steam where they decide to keep Cooper Kupp in 25 too. So do you think it's possible the Rams will just run it back on offense?
Well, there's always been a non-zero chance that Kupp comes back. They don't want him at the price he's at. I don't think they want him for the length of the rest of his contract. Les Snead did say recently that him coming back was the least likely option. Not totally out of the question. They'd like to move on from him, I think, even with, Stafford coming back, in part because Puka Nacua is just a younger, faster, equally as productive Cooper Kupp. And, Tutu Atwell isn't the answer. He's not going to be the reason that they don't bring
a $10 million deal. That seemed extraordinary to me.
It's the devil,
Devil might be right. I mean, that is fully a third of the cap hit that you get for Kupp. I would take Kupp 3 times more than.
Maybe, but Kupp's been battling injuries and missing a lot of time. He's 31 years old now, maybe
32.
32. It's just like, they are with draft picks, they're F them vets. Les Snead and Sean McVay are like, you've outlived your usefulness here. They have Very hard and direct thoughts on how they approach certain positions. They do it. We see it all the time with them, with defensive backs. They rarely have defensive backs get a second contract from them. They keep cycling through safeties. They just keep drafting them, producing them. But I think that, I think Kupp still has some value. I don't know what it is from a fantasy perspective, because I do think he moves on. Maybe it's going to be a post-June 1 cut. Maybe they are successful in moving them. We saw with Debo, if the team is willing to eat a bunch of salary, you can move them for a better pick. And if you're not willing to eat salary, you're going to end up with a crappy pick. So,
I mean, even with Kupp on the roster, I'm looking at it. They still have a little over 55 million in cap space, which has them sitting 11th, and that's after Matthew Stafford's reworked deal. Stafford and Kupp definitely two of the highest up there for them, but it'd be curious to see what happens there. One player who is moving teams, Deebo Samuel, his saga has ended. He was traded to the Commanders. Now joins Terry McLaurin there alongside Jaden Daniels. Felt like a good move to me. It doesn't seem like they are going to bring back Zach Ertz, who was kind of the number two. They really struggled to find consistency in a number two receiver opposite McLaurin. I like that actually for both players. I like his potential adding to the running game, especially since they don't really have any dominant backs there in Washington. But what did you think of the move?
I like it a lot, but Debo's 29 years old now, pushing 30. I do have concerns about consistency with him. I think Jaden Daniels, he's the type of weapon Daniels can make use of, but Daniels runs a lot more than Brock Purdy. And McLaurin is the number one there. So I do think we'll see, from a fantasy perspective, we're still going to see some fluctuation in Deebo Samuel's production, fantasy point production. But he's going to be the number two there. He's going to be on top of the tight end. He's going to be on top of the running backs. So it's McLaurin and Deebo when it comes to pecking order for passing targets. I think they would be well served to not hand him the ball. Let him be a wide receiver. Stop giving him unnecessary hits when you look back over his career and he gets dinged up. He's fairly sturdy at 5'11", 6 foot, 215, but you keep trying to run him and he keeps getting beat up and missing time. Let him be a wide receiver. Let him work out of the slot, be super dynamic, be opposite of McLaurin's 4.3 speed, and let that team rock and roll a little bit.
He is 29. He just turned 29 in January.
So when I looked, though, I was a little surprised that it was only a 5th round pick that they traded, because of how much money San Francisco had to eat. San Francisco had to eat $31 million in dead cap to move Debo. And that seems pretty high. I would think if I'm eating $31 million, a 3rd round pick probably would be better. But obviously they were ready to move on. They moved him to the East Coast.
Yeah, I think that they just needed some kind of a change. So probably a little bit of it there. Another player who is changing places, Christian Kirk traded a rare interdivision trade, traded from the Jaguars to the Texans. Meanwhile, you referenced the Jaguars also released Evan Ingram. So what do you think of those moves?
I think Ingram lands on his feet somewhere on a 1-year deal, maybe with an option. Maybe he gets a 2-year deal. He's 29, 30 years old also. Productive receiver, but he's had some injury issues. The first contract, New York, battle drops. While in Jacksonville,
Ingram's older
he
than
was,
you think. He's already 30. He
yeah,
will turn 31 before the season begins.
yeah. I mean, he's on this will be his third contract. So yeah, he's probably what, 4-7. He's going into his 7th or 8th year, I think. So that makes sense. But I think he's still productive. He's a move tight end, not a super good blocker, but has some willingness to do it, and he can still catch the ball pretty well, and he still has some athleticism. So I think he lands somewhere, like I said, 1 to 2 year deal. Kirk was interesting. He came into Jacksonville. He was one of the early guys in the Doug Peterson era that they overpaid for at a time when they had to overpay to get vets to come there. And Kirk kind of broke that seal. And then he broke, and he missed lots of time. He was productive when he was healthy. Definitely miscast in the outside receiver role, but an effective slot guy. One of the free agents I got on my list, I really liked as the fit in Houston for what Kirk is going to be doing. Kirk's going to be that slot guy holding that down until Tank Dell gets back. Move outside in 2 wide receiver sets a little bit opposite Nico there. But I like the trade for both teams. We see, ever since the Hockenson trade with Detroit and Minnesota, it seems like every year we see a trade or two of these interdivision foes, because it just makes sense for both of them. Jacksonville said, hey, we're going to release him. And Houston said, hey, we'll send you a 7th round pick. And they're like, well, hell, that's better than getting nothing.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Houston's going to need targets, because you don't know if Diggs is going to be back and Dell not expected to play. Evan Ingram going into year 9. So yeah, a little bit even more experience than you realize. T. Higgins got the franchise tag yet again. Do you think that they will be able to work out a long-term deal?
If they do, it will be at the expense of their defense.
Which is probably why they let Trey Hendrickson trade.
I mean, it's just one of, we saw it for years in Indianapolis with Peyton Manning. Basically, they're going to pay 1 or 2 mid to upper mid, mid-high defensive players like Indianapolis did with Mathis and Dwight Freeney. But the rest of their defense was crap. And it was we're going to let Peyton outscore people. Cincinnati's kind of dressed themselves up in that same model. We're going to have to outscore people. And with Burrow and Chase and Higgins, they're going to outscore a lot of people. But when you get deep in the playoffs, we saw it year after year with Indianapolis, it just doesn't work. You end up running up against teams that not only have offenses that can match you, but defenses. And it comes down to situation. If you're paying a quarterback top dollar for, a 2nd or 3rd contract, and then you start to try to pay top dollar on 2nd contracts for 2 or 3 other offensive players. We see it going on in Kansas City, where their offensive line is suffering because of how much they've had. They gave Mahomes a $500 million contract and then got rid of Tyreek Hill. Their defense now has come around, but their offensive line is crap. And so it's just this constant battle and trade-off. How much money are we going to spend at what positions to try to catch lightning in a bottle? And we see it year after year. Often the team that wins the Super Bowl isn't the best team in the league. It's the healthiest team in the league.
Speaking of teams trying to improve the line, the Bears making moves, acquiring Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson as guards. Does this get you more excited for year 2 of Caleb Williams under Ben Johnson?
I think so. Ben Johnson's familiar with Jonah Jackson. Jonah Jackson is familiar with his scheme. Again, a case of get a head coaching job, bring your guys in to help teach. It wouldn't surprise me to see him bring in, a lower level skill position player, a Brock Wright, a James Mitchell, I forget who Khalif Raymond, one of these guys to help at other positions and sort of accelerate the learning for the rest of the team. Jackson was very good in Detroit and then signed with the Rams. He was a right guard in Detroit. The Rams put him at left guard and moved Steve Avila to center. Avila struggled at center. Jackson struggled at left guard, and then he got injured, and they ended up moving Avila back. The Rams just decided to cut bait. Chicago trades for him. They're going to put him at right guard, and then they bring in Joe Thuney from Kansas City, who had a nice run moving out to tackle, but has been a left guard most of his career. So now you've got two interior anchors to build that offense around. They've got a couple okay tackles. They probably need a center, and they need their two tackles to step up their game. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Bears draft a tackle in the first or second round. The tackle group is pretty good early in this draft. And they still got Roma Dunze and DJ Moore, DeAndre Swift, and Cole Kmet. So their focus needs to be build it from the inside out. Let's see how it goes.
Can't be any worse.
Nope.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit. The NFL Combine, it was just kicking off when we were last together last Thursday. Really, a lot of the players of note in positions that we are concerned about went on Saturday. But Dennis, any risers for you after the Combine?
I kind of snagged one at each position just for the hell of it. And I'll start at quarterback, where Jackson Dart has, in the offseason, he was QB3, QB4, QB5, QB6, QB5, QB4. He's been moving around. He started, close to 50 games or played close to 50 games in college. I was listening to the Dynasty Nerds podcast earlier. As a Dynasty nerd myself, I highly recommend it. And they, 3 weeks ago, they did a draft primer episode. And one of the things, and maybe it was their quarterback breakdown, they did two quarterback breakdown episodes. One of the things that their research has shown, that quarterbacks that play at least 35 games in college have a much higher success rate than quarterbacks who play fewer games in college. And Jackson Dart is a pretty toolsy quarterback, has some pretty good mobility, good arm, pretty accurate. Played close to 50 games. He played a lot of games at USC and a lot of games at Ole Miss. So he's played in some big programs. And I think he's separated himself from the Ewers, the Howard, there's a couple other quarterbacks in that tier there that I'm forgetting. And I think Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart are probably closer together than Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. Charles Davis of NFL.com released a mock draft here in the last couple days, and he had the Giants taking Jackson Dart at 3, if I remember correctly. So he's a believer. I don't know if I believe in Dart or Sanders enough to take him at 3, but when you kind of look at what this lead up to the draft has been, Jackson Dart has done well. He threw at the Combine. He threw pretty well. There were a couple other quarterbacks that kind of stunk it up, but he threw well at the Combine. He measured well. He seems to have a lot of the intangibles and the experience. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see him squeak into the first round. My second guy, Jaden Higgins from Iowa State. We say it every draft season. I'm team big wide receiver. And Higgins is kind of one of these guys, only really played a couple seasons, 6'4", ran a 4.47 40. He's big, he's fast, he's explosive, had a 39-inch vertical, 10.8 broad jump. And his last two seasons, his senior season, he was productive. 87 catches, 1,183 yards, and 9 touchdowns. In a draft that doesn't have a ton of wide receiver talent, he's a guy that I wouldn't be surprised to see him drafted wide receiver 4 after Tet McMillan and Emeka Egbuka, Luther Burden, maybe wide receiver 5. Matthew Golden ran really well, so he's kind of shooting up too. So I like what Higgins brings to the table. There's some things that he's not equipped to do. He isn't like, he's kind of the opposite of what Emeka Egbuka does with the short area bursts and quick moves. He's a little reminiscent of a more effective Mike Williams. He's good at the catch point, but he's a little bit faster, a little more polished as a route runner, I think, than Mike Williams was. So I like Jaden Higgins. I don't think he makes his way into the first round, but like I said, it wouldn't surprise me if he's wide receiver 4 or 5 off the board. At running back, and I'm not sure that he's a riser. He's been in the top few running backs, but Omarion Hampton, a lot of the run up to the draft has been, and a lot of the drafts, NFL drafts over the past few seasons have really de-emphasized running backs. And I think we're seeing the pendulum swing back the other way some. And Omarion Hampton, 6 foot or 6'1", 220, 225 pounds, a good size back, a bell cow size back, who looks like he could move into the, he could find himself up in the second round. I could see the Chargers grabbing him. They need to do something with their running back position. It's just a guy that is an effective runner. He's got good vision. He's competent catching the balls. You're not going to see him out there running routes, like a wide receiver, but he's going to help you in that he's got the size to be an effective blocker. Probably needs to work on pass protection a little bit, but he has the size and the willingness. So, maybe not a riser in the strictest sense of the word. I wouldn't be surprised to see him squeak into the back half of the first round. And then at tight end, I grabbed Mason Taylor as my riser. He had an excellent combine. He's one of these pedigreed players. His mom is Hall of Famer Zach Taylor, or Zach. I keep thinking Zach Randolph, the basketball player, the Miami middle linebacker.
Jason Taylor?
No, Jason Taylor is his dad. Zach. Oh, I wish I could remember it. Anyways, Jason Taylor's wife was his sister. And so he's pedigreed. Taylor is, phenomenal athlete, defensive end, and his uncle, fantastic linebacker in the NFL for a long, long time. So he knows what it's like to be around the game, and he was productive in college. He didn't do the athletic testing, but he looked very good in the receiving drills. Checks in with great size, 6'5", 251. He just brings a lot to the table. And in a draft where, you basically have Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren at the top of the tight end pecking order. I think he's pushing to be the third tight end off the board.
Let's go to the flip side. Were there any concerning results or any surprises for you? Any guys that maybe you feel are slipping post combine?
So Tez Johnson of Oregon, and it's hard for me to say that, he seems like he's fallen a bit. After watching how he played against Ohio State, he kind of tore our defensive backs up. But he only ran a 4.51 official 40, which at 154 pounds, I think you got to be a little bit faster. He's going to struggle getting away from the line of scrimmage if he's pressed. He's going to have to learn a lot of technique to be able to get past that. I don't think he's going to be an outside receiver. I think he's going to be a slot guy. So he's going to be having to make his way through traffic. On the plus side, elite explosiveness and agility, he makes his hay with separation. So he should be able to be a decent fantasy asset. Just being as small as he is, I don't know what his ceiling is going to be. We see a lot of, small, quick guys come into the league that dominated, played really well in college, and they just never make the transition. So, he gives me pause. I'm not sure where I want to go, where I'm going to have him in my rookie rankings. He played well against Ohio State, and Ohio State's got, NFL caliber corners. And so for me, I want to kind of see where he lands. What does it look like his role is going to be? What's his path to opportunity? And sometimes, we see guys, they go to the combine and they run a 4.55 40. And then you get them on the field and they play 4.45. And we see guys at the combine run a 4.4 40, and then they get on the field and they play 4.55. So when you watch the film, a lot of it, Tez Johnson looks like he plays faster than he times, and a lot of that's his quickness and agility. We'll just have to see how he handles these stronger NFL defensive backs. A couple of the quarterbacks kind of in that second or third or fourth tier, didn't have great showings. Will Howard seemed like he was on the rise. He had a pretty good season for Ohio State. Coming into the year, he didn't have a great completion percentage. Chip Kelly got 71% completions out of him, threw for 35 touchdowns. It can be argued that when you've got Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate at wide receiver, it's easy to make a drastic improvement over the cast he played with at Kansas State. But when he made that run in the CFB playoff, he was making some good throws. He was fitting them in tight windows. He was throwing with anticipation. He looked really good. He went to the combine and just could not get timed up with the receivers there. A lot is going to be hanging on his pro day, March 26th, when he's throwing to Ohio State players that he's familiar with. He's got some work to do. There was a while where I thought he could be, he could push Jackson Dart for QB3. Now it looks like he's QB5, 6 at best. So we'll have to kind of see how the rest of the pre-draft process plays out. But we see it all the time. It only takes one team to fall in love with you. Another guy that I thought would, maybe show a little better at the combine was Dylan Gabriel. Another over 50 games played, a lot of starts at a couple different colleges. I thought he might show better at the combine, measuring in at 5'10", not having a very strong arm, not being very accurate at the combine. I don't know if he's going to be draftable for fantasy. There was a point where, here a few weeks ago, I felt like because of his size, because he was left-handed, that he seemed like a great option for Miami to bring in. They have a timing-based offense, smaller quarterback, throws left-handed, and Tua does. And so it felt like he would be kind of that ideal type of backup to provide consistency if Tua missed time. I don't think so. I don't think he's got what it takes, despite the fact that he played so many games in college. So I think we're going to see him fall. And then at running back, here's where we run into this whole, well, he timed this, but he plays this. Ollie Gordon out of Oklahoma State, his 2023 season was phenomenal. I think he led the NCAA in rushing, rushed for over 1,700 yards, went to the combine, ran a 4.6 140. We've seen David Montgomery ran a 4.6 140. Backs can do that, and you're not going to, a lot of times we get enamored with these running backs that we feel like, guys like Travion Henderson, who once they get to the second level, it's a race and they can take it, 85 yards on any given touch. We fall in love with that, but that's really the exception. What we want out of our running backs, or what we should be looking, is a guy like Gordon, who's 220 pounds, who can carry the ball 20 times a game and hold up to the pounding, can be serviceable in the passing game. Break you off chunks like Montgomery. He's going to make a 5-yard gain, an 8-yard gain, and an 8-yard gain, a 12-yard gain. By the time you get to the fourth quarter, he's busting it off for 15 or 16. Ollie Gordon kind of falls into that archetype in my eyes. So his game is not based on speed, but 4.61 is a little disappointing. He did have a, 1,732 yards in 23, 880 yards in 24, 6.1 yards per carry in 23, 4.6 in 24. Touchdowns went from 21 to 13. So there was a precipitous drop-off in his production from 23 to 24. Some of it can be chalked up to the team wasn't as good, but he's a guy you're going to want to look at draft capital and path to opportunity when you're stacking your board for your dynasty drafts. You muted.
That's what happens when you have to cough. That's a look at
on incessantly. So
some of the combine, getting closer to the draft in April. But before that, we have free agency. As I mentioned, the official start to the new league year is Wednesday, March 12th, when all of these deals can become officially official. But the legal tampering period, where they will start to announce more and more deals, kicks off on Monday, the 10th. So Dennis and I have highlighted 5.
Before we jump into free agents, let's talk about Shedeur Sanders for a second.
I don't see a point.
He's gotten a ton of negative press coming out of the combine, and I get it. We want to see people do stuff, but a lot of the stuff that's coming out has been he didn't take the interviews seriously. He didn't seem to pay attention, didn't seem like he wanted to talk to us. And I don't want to say that, by no means is it acceptable to blow off an interview, which is what these are. But you've got to remember his heritage, where he comes from. If you think back to when Deion Sanders was coming out, the New York Giants were like, hey, let's go talk. And he literally said, what pick do you have? And they were like, oh, pick 20 or something. He's like, nah, I'm not going to be there then. And he basically was like, I'm just not going to, it doesn't make sense for us to talk. Somebody asked about going to someplace he didn't want to go. And he literally said, I'm going to ask for so much money that they'll have to put me on layaway. It's just, and when you use that to provide some of the context for Shedeur Sanders, Shedeur Sanders in his 2 years at Colorado, I think he set the record for highest completion percentage. Is he a phenomenal athlete in the Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson realm? No. Does he have an arm like Mahomes or Allen? No. But I think he's a guy that has played enough and has a feel for what he's a timing quarterback. He's going to be one of these guys that's he's going to be able to make most of the throws, but it's going to be predicated on timing. And, some of this feels like people creating a smokescreen to get him to fall. Do you have some guys that don't always nail the interview? Of course. But
you and I are on completely different pages. I think he's incredibly overrated and will be a bust, and whichever team takes him will have regrets. So I would not touch him. I lived the Shedeur Deion Sanders experience the last 2 years. I'm just thankful he's no longer going to be on my news here or on the TV feeds here for the University of Colorado. I think he's bad. None of those reports about interviews surprised me if you had to watch him on TV for the last 2 years, as I have. So he is exactly what they're making him out to be. So we're on completely different pages with that. I guess we'll see what happens. Probably end up with some bankrupt franchise like the Jets anyway, and they're gonna wish they still had Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, that's a hard pass for me on Aaron.
Did you see it? Apparently the team that looks like they're most likely to take Aaron Rodgers,
the Giants.
What happened to wasn't it? It doesn't feel like it was that long ago when we had all three New York teams, including Buffalo, that were like winning on top of the world, and they've just cratered.
It all falls apart.
So free agents, why don't we alternate? Why don't you give me your first free agent that you are watching?
All right. So my first free agent is Sam Darnold. I think he's at the top of the quarterback chain when it comes to free agents. And I get it. There's a lot of history of, his time with the Jets and his time in Carolina. And I suppose some argument can be made that he wasn't really set up to have the most success in either of those situations. And that Kevin O'Connell is a quarterback whisperer, and anybody that plays for him is going to be super successful. I get it. But I think Darnold is better than anybody else in the free agent quarterback market. Zach Wilson, Jacoby Brissett, Jarrett Stidham, Justin Fields. And don't get me wrong, I love Justin Fields and I want him to be successful. But if I'm tasked with taking Darnold or Fields, I'm going to take Darnold. Teams that need quarterbacks, well, I had the Vegas on here, but they just got Geno. So I'm going to change that to Seattle. Seems like Seattle would be a great fit right now. The Giants, the Jets, both need quarterbacks. I don't think either of those makes sense, really. I think it is.
I can't fathom Darnold going back to the Jets.
Yeah, I just pick teams that need quarterbacks.
No, I mean, and there have been a lot of people talking about, that would be a cool story. I guess I don't. It's like if you had a place where you pissed your pants in public, would you want to go revisit that place?
Depends on if I'm drunk again or not.
Yeah.
Cleveland needs a quarterback. Pittsburgh needs a quarterback. It feels like Seattle is where he should go. Sign a 3-year deal in Seattle. They can draft a quarterback to play behind you to develop. I've kind of been targeting Jackson Dart since I heard the news about Geno getting traded. But it just, to me, Darnold is the jewel. Now, I get it. It's not a great free agent quarterback class if Darnold is the jewel. He's got one pretty good year and a bunch of years that, leave a lot to be desired.
An interesting place to me too, that I think it sure seems like the Tennessee Titans are set on either taking Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter, but we also know that they don't believe in Will Levis and are not going to roll with Mason Rudolph as QB1. Darnold would be an interesting fit.
Yeah,
you have to figure they're going to go for somebody.
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. That almost feels like a targeting 2026 operation. But yeah, I agree. Honestly, Darnold is the top quarterback in the free agent market. And if I were drafting Cam Ward or Shadir Sanders or Jackson Dart, I think I'd rather start Darnold this year.
Yeah, I think he is the biggest domino in this class. I figured you'd be drawn to that. I went with Justin Fields. What's interesting to me about Fields is he seemed to have no market and no value at this time last year. They practically couldn't give him away. Then he went to the Steelers. I didn't think he played too badly, but they tossed him over for Russell Wilson, and we thought, well, maybe that's that. But coming out of it, he seems to be the much more attractive candidate that has many more teams talking about him and his fit than Russell Wilson, who's also a free agent. I'll be curious to see if he does end up going back to Pittsburgh, or they've talked about him maybe going to the Jets. He has a connection with Garrett Wilson. Would that make Garrett Wilson happier? Because Wilson, another guy that's been kind of frustrated. That might make the Jets
Wilson's just happy Rodgers is gone.
Well, maybe. So he was the interesting one for me. My second guy up, Aaron Jones, a guy who had a great year last year in Minnesota, much like Darnold, is now free. Aaron Jones going out there. I've seen a lot of people talking about him going to Denver, and at first I was like, I don't know, but I do kind of like the idea of mixing him in there, maybe with an Estime, with some of the other. He's a guy that still showed a lot of pop. He's a good receiver. He's still a good running back. Not probably a long-term solution, but if you're looking for somebody to kind of boost your offense, especially, I think he would be a good veteran presence on a younger offense. But
yeah, I love him in Denver. I think that would be great. The thing you have to recognize with Aaron Jones at this stage is he's probably going to max out at about 13 games. And if you're okay with that,
he was much more durable last year. Let me look it up. He appeared in all 17 games.
But he had games where he kind of disappeared. He didn't get as much volume.
255 carries. That's more than he had in any year in Green Bay. He also saw 62 targets, caught 51 passes. He was pretty durable.
Yeah, I like Aaron Jones. I think, going into his age 31,
but 30, he would be better in a committee. I think if the Vikings had anyone else that they could have used, they had to stitch together, two blown Achilles Cam Akers to roll out there. That Ty Cham, I think, kind of platooned. Who is your number two?
My number two is Najee Harris. I get it. He's not explosive. He's never been explosive. You didn't draft Najee Harris because you thought he was explosive. He's a volume guy. He's somebody you're going to ride. 6'1", 230 pounder, 225 pounder. He finished his RB22 last year on a team that was dismal. I get it. They won some games, but Justin Fields, for all of the praise he gets for going 4-2, doesn't run a very balanced offense. And, he's still got limitations throwing the ball. And Russ wasn't great. And a lot of times they were taking Harris out and trying to, do hurry up, third down type of stuff with Jaylen Warren, who's also a free agent. I like Najee to go somewhere to just be that grinder. Like, pair him with DeAndre Swift in Chicago. Give Ben Johnson that thunder and lightning kind of pairing. Or Las Vegas needs a running back. The Zamir White, Amir Abdullah, Alexander Madison, Dylan Lobby group. That's
wasn't doing it for you.
Well, was not getting it done. Did not even give me a half a chub, to be honest. It was just
they could go get their own half a chub since Nick's available.
Yeah, that's about what's left after those knees. No, I think Najee Harris, if the Chargers, he'd be great in Los Angeles. He'd give them 3-down capability with Justin Herbert. So there's teams out there that if they don't hit what they're looking for in the draft when it comes to running backs, there's a lot of depth at the running back position in the draft. But if you're drafting a running back in the 5th or 6th round, it's going to take some time, I think, before you have confidence to stick him in there and give him 20 touches. You can bring Najee Harris in for 3 years, front load it, so you can get out after 2, get out after 1. However, those capologists, magicians do that stuff. But he's going to come in and he can carry the ball 250, 275 times, catch 40 or 50 passes. Early in his career, his rookie year, he had a great season catching the ball. So I like Najee Harris being out there. He's probably, Aaron Jones is good. Najee's 27 years old, going to be 27. I think he's a guy that will provide you that bell cow experience. You just got to recognize he's not twitchy. You're not signing him to be this super explosive guy. He's a guy that if you block for 4, he's going to get you 6. If you block for 6, he's going to get you 7. Occasionally he's going to get you 20. But he's a guy that is going to be able to just keep your offense moving forward.
Who's your number 3 guy?
Number 3, I started dipping into the wide receiver group. I saw you had 2 running backs, and I looked at the running backs that were still left, and I did have to convince myself Najee was the best option in that group. Number 3, I got Hollywood Brown. He missed most of last season with an injury, came back for the last two games. You see him here. He's almost 28 years old, but he's fast. I don't think he's a guy that you're going to give 140 targets to, but if you give him 80 to 100 targets, he's still explosive. We saw when he came back in Kansas City, week 16 and 17, he had averaged about 8 targets a game there. Those last 2 weeks there, 15 targets, 9 catches, 91 yards on just a 33% snap share. So if he can be healthy and you can get 70% snap share, 75, 80% snap share, I think he can give you a 1,000-yard season. I think he can give you, 65, 70 catches. I don't know if he can give you wide receiver 1 numbers, but he can give you mid to high wide receiver 2 numbers as long as he stays healthy and you're in a fairly high volume passing attack. Some of these teams, the wide receiver 2 is great on them. Other teams, the wide receiver 2 is, a wide receiver 3 or 4 on some other teams. So I like Hollywood Brown. It'll be interesting to see where he lands. Jacksonville, they need receivers now. Trading away Christian Kirk. They still got Gabe Davis, who's got kind of a cumbersome contract. He's going to be there 1 more year. I think Brown would be a pretty nice compliment to Brian Thomas. Houston could use a wide receiver. I know they got Christian Kirk, who they can play out of the slot. Nico Collins, who's an alpha. Throw Hollywood Brown there on the outside. I think that could be a nice pairing there.
So my third guy is Javonte Williams. As a rookie, I was so excited to see him. He had 903 yards, 4 touchdowns, averaged more than 4 yards per carry. Got injured kind of early in that second year, and we've just never really seen it develop that much. He's only 25. And I'm curious to see what he could do in a different system. I don't know that he ever really resonated with what Sean Payton wanted to do. It feels like Payton wants to go in a different direction. But I still have quite a few shares of Javonte Williams, and I'm going to be curious to see where he ends up. I think he could still be a good contributor in the right system. My fourth guy, probably to me was the best of the free agent wide receivers once Higgins got the tag, and that is Chris Godwin. Godwin unfortunately only had 7 games last year before he got injured, but he saw 62 targets, caught 50 for 576 and 5 touchdowns in those 7 games. He was tracking to have a monster season. The 3 seasons prior to that had 127 targets or more. He had 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons. I think he is still a good and productive receiver. He's going to be 29. So he's not super young anymore, but teams that are looking for, I think he probably would be a better number 2 right now. If he gets a big contract for New England, he'll still be better than anyone New England had, but I don't know if that's.
There'll be no Kayshon Boutte slander on this show.
He'll still be better than any receiver New England has, but probably more a great number 2. But I liked what I've seen from him over his career in Tampa Bay. Doesn't look like he's going to be back in Tampa Bay. I'm excited to see where he might end up. Who is your number 4?
My number 4 is Elijah Moore in Cleveland. He had a rocky road in New York with the Jets, got moved to Cleveland. He finished as wide receiver 65 last year. But between weeks 7 and 13, when Jameis Winston was doing his thing, he was wide receiver 31. He only had 3 games at 60% or more snaps, and he played 53% of his snaps from the slot. I really thought he would be a great fit in Houston. I don't think that happens now that they traded for Kirk. But there are some spots that could use an athletic slot receiver.
Maybe right back to Jacksonville.
Well, Cleveland would be a good spot. But you're right. Jacksonville is on my list of teams that could use a slot receiver. Part of that was, they had stated they were going to cut Kirk, and I thought, well, he'd be a nice compliment for Brian Thomas. Pittsburgh needs a slot receiver. They need 2 receivers to pair with George Pickens that don't take so much away from Pickens. It's tough because so in Pittsburgh, you've got Arthur Smith as your offensive coordinator who wants to run the ball 65 times. I don't think George Pickens will ever be happy in Pittsburgh with Arthur Smith as the coordinator. He needs to be on a pass-happy team so that he gets enough volume that even when he fails, that the rest of the team gets enough volume to pick him up. Anyways, the Raiders, a good fit there. They need somebody out of the slot. They have Trey Tucker. What's his name? Jacoby Myers. They need to bring in a true number 1, but bringing in Geno now, if they can get a true number 1, bring in more in the slot with Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers, that's going to really open up that passing game. They've got an okay offensive line in Las Vegas. They just need somebody to execute that offense. So I like Elijah Moore. I think he's got top 40 wide receiver capability with, top 30 upside.
Who is your last free agent target?
All right. Had to do some digging in the tight ends, and then once I went and decided who I was going to go, Jacksonville said, well, we're going to cut Evan Ingram. So I didn't change and go away from Evan Ingram. I did consider Juwan Johnson. He's an athletic guy that, it's never really, he's flashed a little bit, but never really panned out. He's currently being rumored to be linked to Sean Payton, so he may be a Bronco. There wasn't a whole lot of other tight ends, so I settled on, who should probably be a wide receiver, which is Mike Gesicki. So he's a 29-year-old receiving tight end. He can't block for shit. He's 6'6". He's a really good athlete. He didn't have big games last year per se. He didn't get consistent volume. In Cincinnati, it's all about Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. When Higgins was out, he did get a little more volume. He did have a couple good games, but it wasn't like he went off. But the Saints are going to need a tight end. They're going to let it looks like they're letting Juwan Johnson walk. They need somebody to come in there. Foster Moreau can be the blocking tight end. They can use Gesicki as the move tight end. Indianapolis, they've been, I think every mock draft you see has them taking Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland. So they're certainly in the market for a tight end. The Jets let Tyler Conklin go. He was their starter. Does that mean they think Jeremy Ruckert or Kenny Yeboah are ready to step up? I don't know. But they could use a receiving tight end to pair with Garrett Wilson. Because as of right now, they need a slot receiver and a second receiver as well. They could bring Gesicki in, and he could be their big slot. So I'm going to keep an eye on Gesicki. He finished his tight end 15 last year. It's not a heavy lift to get up to tight end 1 from where he's at.
Yeah, and the last one that I went with, also a tight end. Sorry, there's a lot of drainage right now. Gotta love the changing seasons of the spring. I went with Zach Ertz. He had a couple of
the athletic antithesis of Mike Gesicki.
He had a couple of rough years to end his tenure in Arizona. Got picked up on a 1-year deal going to Washington, probably because of his familiarity with Cliff Kingsbury's offense. And wouldn't you know, made it all 17 games on 91 targets. Was the second most productive receiver on that Commanders team, a team that went all the way to the NFC title game. 66 receptions, 654 yards, 7 touchdowns. Looked really great. It does not seem like the Commanders are bringing him back. They drafted Ben Sinnott last year. I think they're going to give him a go. They obviously just got Deebo Samuel to get weapons. But Ertz, he's going to be 35, not a long-term place, but we saw last year in the right system, he can be fantasy relevant. I'd like to see, if he can land in a good veteran spot, team that maybe weak at receiver or passing targets, is willing to pepper him with some volume because he held up pretty well. Only played 17 games combined his last 2 years in Arizona, suited up for all 17, started all 17, 91 targets, the most he had seen in a couple of years. Looked like he had found some of the fountain of youth. So be keeping an eye on him. As you mentioned, not a great tight end free agent group, although Evan Ingram coming out certainly makes that a little more interesting. But that will do it for us today. We will be back on Tuesday. We should have the first couple of waves. Maybe a few of these 10 players will be among those early dominoes. I would think Sam Darnold is probably going to be the first big domino at the quarterback position. I would not be surprised to hear his name called early in the day on Monday, but we will be back tracking all those deals. Dennis, if people have some free time and they're pining for the start of free agency, what can they do?
They can go to their favorite podcast platform, hit that search bar, type in the Fantasy Football Roundtable podcast, give us a subscribe, give us a like, leave us a rating, review. We love that shit.
Well, that'll do it for us today. Hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. We will see you on Tuesday when, who knows? At this point in time, Dennis and I could even have been traded.
Maybe.
Trade locations. Do you have better weather this week?
No, it's been high 30s, low 40s.
I'm not accepting that trade. I'm not accepting that trade. All right. You guys have a wonderful weekend. We will see you on Tuesday.